and welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, v'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And here goes with the share. Okay. Hopefully you're going to see this in a moment. And there we are. All right. So it appears to be a whole new subject, right? Lo tochlu al hadam. You shall not eat. And literally al, right? Together with or on, together with its blood. Let's keep going, right? So, doesn't say what, just says you shall not do it. Lo tenachashu, you shall not practice divination. The nachish is to suspect something, right? So Rashi's going to explain much more clearly, I think, what this word means. But it has to do with that kind of necromancy, right? Velo te'onenu, nor shall you, and here, this is Sepharia that I've got, they say soothsaying, practice soothsaying. Again, we need Rashi to clarify. So this is interesting. I mean, it doesn't seem to bear any relationship to what we had just read. And here we are talking about this sort of occult practices. That it's interesting that Judaism, that the Torah wants to get us away from occult practices. And again, I guess, all right, what this comes under is something that is called hukot hagoy, which means practices of nations that are considered to be improper, to use a, to sort of speak it down, right? I don't want to say abominations, but these are considered to be, I'll just try and use a more polite term, but to say, this is not the kind of thing that you want to do. That as part of developing a life of Torah is to avoid various kinds of behaviors and to emphasize other kinds of behaviors. But this is, in sense, it comes under, so the Torah has already mentioned it in Acharei Mot about not copying the practices of other nations. Yes, Alex. Go ahead. I'm not hearing you.
You're muted.
I'm reading the Sefer Yetzirah. I'm kind of a prolific reader, and and it's cool the numbers, the letters, and then they hit the stars last night.
Yeah,
and mentioned astrology, and I go, wait a minute, and they pulled back a little and mentioned it as well. So there's a fine line with Kabbalism, I'm sure.
Okay, so I would tell you that there are statements that sort of say that getting into Kabbalah, you don't want to run before you can walk. And that sometimes those, I've read a little bit of Zohar. I'm not really into it. I feel that personally there's so much regular stuff of which I am ignorant, but there are definite warnings about reading that kind of mystical stuff without having a solid foundation in the regular religion. That's where it's at. So I tend to not involve. It's not that the Zohar isn't a beautiful book, but it does require an intense amount of interpretation. Here we are reading the Torah, the regular Torah, which doesn't get into Kabbalistic kinds of issues, and it also requires, interpretation. I have been known to say that facts may be facts and data may be data, but interpretation, how you choose to interpret those facts, how you would choose to interpret that data, that is reality. So, you'll figure it out, right? Yeah, and see how helpful you find these particular things. So, if you want to comment a little further, I'm happy to.
Well, that's pretty much it. I really like to absorb the alphabet, the letters, the things of that nature
Right.
It's really cool, and it is in the
Okay.
speech and all that, but it can veer off. It can veer off, and I don't know that I want to go there anyway.
Okay.
I'm not
I mean,
into
at
astrology.
some point you may, but hopefully you'll be well prepared, to be able to sort out, how to look at it. So that's
Thank,
but thank you for mentioning that. I think
thank you.
it's something worth considering. Okay. So here we go. Lo tuchlu al hadam. You shall not eat along with the blood or on the blood. And he says, here's where he goes. He says, Laharbe panim nidrash besanhedrin. He says that in the tractate Sanhedrin, this particular peculiar phrase is interpreted in many ways. Harbe panim. There are many faces given to this particular phrase. Okay. Here's one that he gives. All right. He gives just one, as far as I can recollect. Azhara, it is a prohibition, right? Shelo yochal mi basar, that he should not eat from the meat, kadoshim. Look at this. In other words, bipsar kodshim, from sacrificial meat, lifnei zirikat damim, before its blood service is done. So let me explain that basically there was a part of the sacrifice after they slit the neck of the animal, all right, they would immediately collect that blood, and they would take that blood. We've probably talked about it already in other parts of Leviticus, and they would put some of it on the horns of the altar. It depended on the specific sacrifice, but it's called the blood service of that. And that's what he's saying, that that needs to happen before those parts of the sacrifice that are to be consumed, in some cases only by the priests, but in some cases by the person who brought the sacrifice in a case of shlamim, where he and his family, if they were in a state of purity, could partake of the sacrifice, could not be done before the blood service was performed. So that's one way to understand this generalized statement, right? Now here we go. Here's another example. The azhara and a prohibition. The ochel mibehet chulim. This is a case of non-sanctified meat, right? This is a case of chulin meat. Chulin refers to the meat you go to the kosher butcher to buy, right? This is to eat from cattle of chulin, non-sanctified. Terem shetetze nafsha, before it dies. You can't, there was a practice, I guess, before refrigeration. They used to talk about an aver min hachai, right? This is actually one of the Noahide laws. They would take an unessential limb of the animal while it was still alive and excise that limb or amputate that limb and eat it, and that way they had more fresh meat, right? But he gives you two examples, right? So you should not eat regular meat before it had tetzei nafsha, until its soul has departed. For od harbe, and a whole bunch more, he says. So if you ever study Tractate Sanhedrin, he tells you the page number too, I think. Yep, 63. You'll find a lot of interpretations of this particular verse. Okay. Lo tenachashu. So now it's interesting that these are connected, right? Take some thought as to if there is a connection, right? Lo tenachashu, he says. And again, this is in Sanhedrin, page 66. So obviously they're following to some extent the order of the verse here in the Talmud there. Kagon, for example, Elu hamenachashim bechulda, right? They're those who look at a mole's or a weasel's behavior and they divine from that, right? Uva ofot, or with birds. And he gives a little bit more of a clearer example. Pito nafla mipiv. So his bread, right? The bread he had fell from his mouth. In other words, something that happened perhaps totally accidentally. And he looks at that and says, that's a sign of X. another example. Tzvi hifsiko baderech. He was walking along the way, and suddenly a deer appeared in the way and blocked his path. And he says, "Oh, that means X, Y, and Z." To interpret these particular events or occurrences that happen, but to give it some sort of occult or further interpretation that would not be appropriate. So he says, he's talking about a general attitude about how you interpret the various, interpretation, right? How you interpret these particular occurrences. So what is about lo te'onanu, right? Don't Safaria translates that as a soothsaying, right? He says, Lashon unot. He says, this is the language, has the meaning of unot, times or seasons, v'shaot, and hours. She'omer, this is someone who says, Yom ploni, such and such a day, yafel lahachil melacha. This is a propitious day on which to start a particular labor that he has. But doing it not because he's looking at the fact that the weather is bad or something that would involve, natural reasons for not doing it, but some kind of astrological or whatever way of doing it. Here we go. Sha'a plonit, X and X hour, kashe latzeit, it's a bad time to leave. But again, for sort of occult reasons. So this is worth one more comment. So it's not saying that those things may not actually, be occurring. It isn't saying that. And in elsewhere, it doesn't say those things can't happen or whatever. It says we don't practice it. Whether or not there's any legitimacy to this from other factors, we're told not to engage in that kind of thing. And to take it a step further, I believe, is what it's trying to emphasize here is our complete dependency on Hashem, our complete dependency on our belief in this transcendent creator, and that we have this direct pipeline, that there aren't these kinds of things that God doesn't control. So that if there is any legitimacy to astrology and stuff like that, and certainly the reason why the Babylonians were actually quite fine astronomers, given the technology of the time, had more to do with their belief in astrology. And to this day, of course, we have people who practice this kind of stuff. And what is being emphasized here is to whatever degree that stuff actually is legitimate, guess what controls it? So ultimately, God controls those things too. And so I see this is just a one way of looking at it, of that this kind of law tries to come to train us to put our full, complete, and utter dependency on God. A new idea, maybe related in some ways. We'll see. Here we go. Lo takifu pa'at roshchem. So some of you are familiar with the word hakafa, right? That's what we do on Simchat Torah and on Sukkot. And it refers to marching around in a circle surrounding the synagogue, making that march, that circumambulation, the hakafa. And it's the same root, and it means to put a surrounding border, pa'at roshchem, the corner of your heads. Right. So essentially, to put this in English, it's saying tonsures. You don't do that. And he's going to describe it. Lo takifu pa'at roshchem, right? You shouldn't put the surrounding border or mark a surrounding border around your head. And this is in Tractate Makot, page 20. Ze hamashvet tzadav, right? This is utzdav. This is somebody who mashveh is to sort of make equal his temples, la'achorei ozno, and behind his ears, ulefadachto, and his forehead, V'nimtza hekef rosho agul. And so now there is a circle around his head, that his head is surrounded by a circle, saviv, all around. Also, clearly that had some, we know, of course, that in some monastic orders, this is something they did. So it must have had some kind of significance, whether it signified a crown of some kind, I don't know. Whether it was a certain type of personal practice, religious practice, but having some significance in that sense, I'm not sure. Okay, achorei oznav, behind his ears, akru sa'aro, he's uprooted his hairs, he's removed his hairs, lamala mitzvah, above his temples, harbe, a great deal. So again, this whole idea of tonsures is prohibited here in this particular verse. V'lo tashchit et ba'at saganecha, and you shall not destroy the corner of your beard, right, of your beard. So again, ba'at saganecha, sof hazakan. This is the end of the beard, ugvulav, and its borders. Ve'hein chamish. There are 5 corners that we're talking about here. Shtaim b'chol lechi, 2 on each cheek, the lechi, unless it's b'chol lechi v'lechi, lamala etzel harosh, above, or maybe it's lechi, the part of the cheek that is above, closer to the head, shehu rachav, which is wider, ve'yesh bo shtei pe'et, and there are 2 corners, v'achat lamata b'santero, and one below on his chin, makom chibur shnei halachayam yachad, the place where his 2 cheeks come together. So again, we sometimes see in certain Hasidic or maybe other Orthodox cultures the idea of peyot, where they let their side locks grow long. So lahashchit is understood to mean like shaving. This is defined elsewhere because it uses this particular verse and the idea of where you shave with a blade and the blade sort of gets below the skin surface and destroys the hair. So whether we're talking about a depilatory of some kind that prevents it from growing anymore, but lahashchit means to completely destroy. Okay, let's keep going. The seret lanefesh lo titnu bivsarchem, and a cut for a soul, right? So we'll again need to interpret these ideas. Lo titnu bivsarchem, you shall not put in your flesh. Uktovet kaka, this is referring to tattooing, right? This is writing kaka, again, has to make this kind of permanent mark. Lo titnu bachem, you shall not place among you, right, in you, ani Hashem, I am the Lord. So let's take a look at the Rashi on this. Seret lanefesh. Kain darchan shel Amorim. This was the practice of the Amorites. Liyot mesatin besarim. They would put cuts in their flesh. Keshemet lahem mate. When one of their close relatives died. So I was reading, of course, I just finished reading James Michener's Hawaii, and clearly early on, before the missionaries came and changed everything, they had very severe practices. He discusses one of the Eloi who loses his wife, and he puts out one of his eyes, and he knocks out his 2 front teeth, etc. So there were this kind of practice going on, and this is considered to be, of course, Canaan practice, not to copy it. Let's go on. See what he has to say here. Ktovet Kaka. This is again in Makot 21. Ketav HaMechukeh Ushakua, right? So again, Lauren, what do you have as HaMechukah? Can you tell me? Can you come off mute if you are on mute? Okay. Shakua.
Sorry.
It's
Okay. So you're talking about the verse. My verse says Uchtove Kaka
Yes.
Rashi.
Yes.
Okay, mine doesn't have that makot in parentheses.
Okay, that's fine. It's an editorial
It
remedy.
says an inscribed, an inscription etched and
Okay.
sunken.
Okay. Yeah, that's shkua. So I needed the word etched. I didn't have a chance to get that in. So I'm going to do that now. Thank you. And sunk in, she'eno nimchak lo'olam, which can basically is permanent, is what he's saying. A permanent mark with, and of course, again, the Hawaiian people is practicing tattoos is something, of course, they did, right? We know. Shemikaka'o b'machat, he's saying that he etches it or he sinks it in with machat, with a needle. Look how old tattoo practices go, right? Vahu mashchir le'olam, and it darkens the skin there for permanently. Takes the word kaka, he says lashon vahu hotam. So it has to do with they were, I believe hukaotam refers to being impaled, right? It has the connotation of impaling. And bahu kanum, and they were impaled. This is from the second book of Samuel. Goes to
For some
explain.
reason, mine says hang them instead of
Yes.
impaled.
Yes.
Hang them and sink them, but
Right. So I've seen this word translated as to hang. I've also seen it as impale. And of course, in this context, it makes more sense
sure
that
does.
impaled, right? So, and he goes on, Tochvim eitz ba'aretz. They push a piece of wood into the earth, vetolin otam alehem, and they hang them. This is hang, litlot, on them. ונמצאו מחוקים ותכלובים בקרקע. Okay, so he says, and so exactly what he's he's referring here to what was going on in the impaling here, right? They hang them on them. ונמצאו מחוקים ותכלובים בקרקע. So I'm not sure again, mechukim, tochavim is to hang on to be pulled in the earth. So limchok generally means to erase or something like that. And here's this French word, okay? Pour font or something like that, I don't know. But he says, hinein steckend. So steckend, of course, means impaled, right? Stuck in them, right? And another French word here, which I do not recognize, but he says, stossen durchgeroben. So it means like, that sounds like rubbed into. Again, talking about the process of tattooing here, right? Belas in a foreign tongue. Okay, let's stop here. And we'll continue, God willing, tomorrow with this. Let me stop the share. So, you know how popular tattooing is. So the issue becomes, is the tattooing they're talking about here, is it about doing it for the dead? Remember, we had the sort of that context here. Or is it tattooing, period? And I will tell you that I really, to my mind, I obviously I don't practice it, but I also I want to be respectful as to what is the attraction, what is the deeper sense of the need to tattoo. And in having a discussion with someone else, they came up with a possible idea. And look at the context, by the way, that in a way it has to do with cutting. And we know that people who are in deep, having experienced some kind of psychological pain, for whatever the reason, can sometimes find cutting themselves, um, that it gives them some release. And whether tattooing has some connection to that, but there has to be a reason, I figure. There always is a reason as to why people would engage in that, per se. I think as opposed to situations where someone has a disfigurement and a tattoo is capable of helping out with that disfigurement. But what is the deeper meaning of
Well,
this?
I have a tattoo.
Yes.
And on my ankle.
Okay.
For me, it was just a stamp of individuality.
Okay.
It was my friend and I got in a contest about who was going to get the tattoo first.
That always gets you into trouble.
He went over the bars. He's a
Yes.
amateur bicycle racer.
Okay.
He went over the bars and broke his collarbone. So he put
Mm-hmm.
a bicycle on his collarbone, but I got mine first.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a sign of individuality, like this is me and this is who I am and this is what I wanted. It's just a blue moon.
Can I suggest something?
Sure.
When people say I did this for this reason and it's just this, there's also a reason why they did that for that reason
Right.
and not something else,
Right.
or not something like other people's choices would have been. And I believe that our motivations for doing anything that we feel like we're consciously choosing to do are very complex and mixed. And what we're conscious of is kind of the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot underlying it. So I'm kind of supporting what Rabbi says. So I'm not saying that you're wrong or that you're not speaking truthfully. I'm saying yes, and there may be a lot more to it than you understand. And actually, if you put more conscious effort into it, you might start to understand deeper about why specifically you did that to show, why would you want to show individuality? Why would you choose that way to show? There's just more whys and more ands, and you can go forever doing that and find more truths.
Right. But I'm not that deep, so.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that it's something that's necessarily you need to do, but that's the way I deal with things. And I've had a lot of training to get to this part, but I really believe it's true based on my experiences.
Oh, I think it's true too. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm not that deep.
Not always.
I wouldn't say that, Kathleen. I know you well enough. I think that's okay. I'm gonna
just a matter
argue.
of
I'm gonna argue with you over the
priority.
I'm not that deep argument. No,
Well,
I mean, you're right. Yeah, Lauren. I mean, I was saying, so I do believe, of course, that fundamentally we all need to feel significant. That there's a deep need for every single individual to feel significant. And of course, celebrating people's birthdays is an amazing way to make a child feel significant, right? But also, the whole idea of the mitzvot are also there to help us feel significant from the point of view of saying, in doing the divine will, in this is something that God wants of me as an individual, given my particular circumstances, etc. That is part of the intense beauty of Judaism, in that when it says Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav, I've come to a point of translating that as who has made us significant through his commandments. And I think, there are lots of different ways to try and feel significant, many of which are actually destructive or self-destructive, and sometimes people practice self-destruction in order to, feel significant.
Right,
It's not uncommon.
right.
And
My son used to
so,
cut on himself
yeah, right.
when he
So,
was a teenager,
yeah, so,
and so he could feel something.
right, right.
Yeah, I've got one of them too. I got it for a number of reasons. I was a teenager at 78. I was 18. And I don't regret it to this day. It's a cobra of all things on my arm. I got it in Atlantic City, and it was a statement. I did want to look cool. I did want to do it against my parents. To
Oh,
this day, even if I'm in the company of what I would consider goody goodies, I would rather have that said, I didn't come up on easy street.
yeah.
So there's a dozen things to Lauren's uh viewpoint.
Question.
Yeah, and it was cutting too. So it is pretty amazing. But and I was not a happy teen.
Tell me how many are, please. Let's start making that list right now.
Yes.
Well, listen, I appreciate this all being on the record. Maybe I need to stop this right away, but I think we've dealt with it. It's okay. I think it's great that we had this conversation, and I am going to stop the recording now.